Thank you for joining us for the Trexin seminar series on reducing the cost of great care. I'm Aviva Clayman. I'll be moderating today. Trexin has great, deep experience in healthcare between payers, providers, and analytics. Today, we're going to hear from Eric Gonzalez, John Kroll, and Armin Conti. Our panelists today have deep experience across healthcare and have worked throughout different venues to delve into how to drive down the cost of great care. So today we're going to hear from our panelists and we're going to go through our agenda. We're going to talk about avenues for cost savings in healthcare, cost of care approach, our total cost of care findings. We're going to run through a provider performance overview, go through a few provider case studies, and we'll summarize and leave some time for questions. In avenues for cost savings in healthcare, cost savings can occur at many intervention points across the payer, provider level, or member level landscape. Trexin's healthcare practice provides providers, payers, healthcare systems, PBMs, medtech, and life science companies a multidisciplinary approach needed to deliver value in an era of massively disruptive change. Healthcare payers can pursue varying avenues to increasing quality care. Eric, can you tell us a little bit more about how healthcare payers can do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Viva. So I think when we started doing cost of care, what we tried to focus on was at a member level, how could we make the biggest impact? And this was primarily driven by creating cohorts from population health insights. And from these cohorts, we were trying to figure out what was the best way to implement a care management system, or what was the best way to optimize case management on the ground for these members. And as we started to look at the higher acuity, higher risk members, we began to see cost savings there. But then we also realized we were leaving some members behind and we needed to take a more widespread approach. And that's really what snowballed into the more network centric or provider approach. And from this, it was trying to focus on making the providers data fluent, trying to build a culture of data around them, trying to increase provider engagement. And from this, we were able to secure more value-based contracting, as well as track their performance over time in terms of how they compare to their peers or benchmarked against their peers. And so when thinking about this cost of care framework, I know what we first talked about was those population health insights. So we're really using a Pareto principle and trying to see what was the 20% driving the 80% of costs. And with our initial engagement, what we found is actually about 10% were driving 80% of the overall costs. And we did this at several clients and we saw similar things, 10% driving 75%, 15% driving 60%, so on and so forth. Within that, you could begin to identify, are there certain conditions within those 10% that are more prevalent than others? So certain clients, we'd see diabetes and asthma. At others, we'd see hypertension and obesity. So that gave the care managers or the case managers an avenue to pursue when it came to intervening on those chronic conditions. And from that turned into more of the how can we identify the network, as we discussed, and really in trying to optimize the network, we needed to benchmark and see how certain providers were performing or how they were managing their members. And with the quality or HEDIS reporting, readmits, length of stay, that was one area that we could see big differences or discrepancies between providers. And with pharmacy, what we began to see is with non-adherence, particularly around those chronic conditions with diabetes or asthma, but also with more acute conditions like HIV or behavioral health conditions. Those could be big factors in determining the quality of care for a member and how you'd want to optimize a network. So that was really how we began the cost of care framework and began to go through those different offerings.
Thank you, Eric. We delve further into the cost of care approach.
Sure. So I think to start, like I said, we've done this at several clients, and every client is really different. Certain clients may have a very mature data and analytics team. Some may have a very mature case management team. Others may not have either, or some may have both, but just needs a little bit more refinement. So this to us is typical engagement and what we'd see. So phase zero is really when we're gathering information before we go on site, trying to just assess the current state. With phase one, we're really validating what we saw in phase zero and beginning those interviews or meetings with the stakeholders. Phase two and three is really about what taking what our findings were and what our validation was, developing those cohorts that we talked about earlier. So if it's diabetes or asthma, trying to identify where we should put boots on the ground, and then actually executing and deploying for those programs. And then phase four for us is really when we try to give that knowledge transfer and client handoff so that they have the proper model in place to carry this out beyond us being there. And from phase zero to phase four, each one of these, again, depending on the organization, can take anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks. So a typical engagement can last anywhere from 4 to 9 months, depending on the maturity of the client.
Can you tell me a little bit more about our total cost of care findings?
I think today we've talked a lot about the high level, what the program could be, but obviously with cost of care and savings, people want to know what the numbers could be from that. And like I said, every organization is different, but with one of our engagements from the analytics that we ran, the cohort development, the optimization, and everything we talked about, we're able to actually generate a cost savings of about $100 million, a little bit over that. And that was through mainly cost avoidance, trying to identify those members and take a preventative approach. And this was as a result of us reducing the MLR and the PMPM of those members for that organization.
Eric, what does MLR and PMPM stand for?
Sure. So MLR is medical loss ratio. It's a common industry standard. It's called different things at other places, but it's essentially your expenses over your revenue. So particularly with government, but even in the commercial space, your MLR would be, for example, if you gave $100 per month for your insurance and you only cost $80, then it'd be 80% MLR. So that's really what we tried to look at and see if people were over that 100% threshold and they're actually costing more than they brought in. And that tended to be with people who had more chronic conditions, and just being able to identify those members, give the correct APIs, and really have standardized automated reports were where our clients saw the value, because then they didn't have to sit and wait to take action. And that was when they began to drive down the cost and see improvement over time. So
thank you, Eric. That was a great example. Can you also explain to me what the PMPM that you referenced earlier?
Sure. So that's per member per month. So dependent on how many members you have across the year, it's also a factor of cost. So if you had, let's say, 12 members and each of them were costing you $100 over the course of the year, then their expense would be $1,200. And if they were each there only for 1 month, then it'd be $100 PMPM. If everybody was there for the entire time, then it'd be 1,200 divided by 144, which I'll do for you, essentially the PMPM. So that was essentially the two things that we looked at in trying to identify those key people with those chronic intervention conditions. And I think while it's great to have the high level of what it would save the organization, I think it's also great to focus on specifically at the member level, how did we make those interventions and what was the net effect on an individual basis for those members.
Thank you, Eric. I think that's a great point. And I'd ask Armin, can you tell us a little bit about a specific member intervention?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Aviva. We'll take a look at a specific patient here. And so for one of the members that we looked at and found through this cost of care process, so we have here a relatively young female in her mid-30s with a history of several chronic conditions. You can see there are a couple of behavioral health issues, diabetes, and that a lot of admissions. So 15 admissions over the last 12 months that were psychiatric related. So over one admission a month, severe illness, found behavior. And so, patients like this, we would often see sort of going in and out of inpatient and emergency care, maybe even using the emergency room as sort of their primary care. And those are the people who we found were good candidates to be enrolled in a behavioral health case management program. And so, like Eric was talking about before, finding that preventative care and getting the right intervention at the right time was really appropriate for members like this. And so you see, here in the middle of the slide, a couple of different steps that were taken for this particular member. And so, starting with discharge planning. So, when that member was admitted into care, getting the right plan to make sure that they were placed in appropriate care after they were discharged from the facility. And so then getting after that, getting daily contact with a case manager, somebody who obviously needed a great deal of attention. And so having conversations with that person, making sure that they were assessed, finding out what those barriers were, and then continuing to monitor. And really, what we were able to find was for this member and a lot of members like this, that adherence to medication ended up being a huge thing that was impacting their care. And so, after getting in touch with this member, getting some of the right interventions, and then continually monitoring, we see the end results here at the bottom. So med spend overall reduced by about 95% for this particular member, which obviously is a huge change, going from $100,000 to about $5,000. And you'll see at the bottom there that where you do see an increase is with that RX spend. And so often what drives that is either getting a member put onto the correct medications, but a really big one, especially for our behavioral health members, was medication adherence. So a lot of those members, it was a challenge to get them just to take their meds. And so having them work with the case manager, finding out what the barriers were, just making sure that they were on the right medications, it's going to drive up a lot of those RX costs, but then drive down things like inpatient admissions, ED visits. And really that's the end goal, was to make sure that we're getting the right interventions and keep them out of the emergency room and out of the hospital.
Yeah, and one thing too to note here that I don't think we talked about earlier was when we're focusing on these cohorts, it is really based off of that first condition or the highest acuity condition that patient has. But a lot of these patients are comorbid and have several conditions that we'd be treating from targeted case management. So even if we may find somebody for schizophrenia or diabetes, they may have one or the other or 7 other conditions that we're treating at that instant. So that's just another important thing to note that we see here with this member in particular.
Thank you, Eric. It's really important to think about that complexity. And Armand, I appreciate the deep dive into a particular member's intervention and how, when you look at it at an individual level, you can really make a difference. I'd like to transition a little bit and look at this through a provider performance lens. So we're going to talk a little bit about provider innovation and collaboration and some governance and operating models. And for that, I'd like to invite John to share a little bit about an overview on that topic.
Sure. Thanks, Aviva. Couple of general points to make about this program before we talk about the details on the slide here. So far, we've been talking about cost of care and really looking at a member, our cohort of members, as the analytics focus. This extends that a bit. So we're looking at providers as well, but we still maintain a strong focus on the members, understanding their true needs in particular, because that helps providers as well. And of course, provider performance. When you're evaluating provider performance, you must look at their caseload. So this approach that we have, the program that you see on the slide, it's really an interlocking set of actions. They all work together. It's keeping with our theme of a sort of a synergistic approach across the 3 main areas of healthcare: provider, payer, and patient. And a lot of it too has to do with sharing data, specifically in this case, sharing data to providers. And there's a lot of ways to do that. There are FHIR is one of the technologies used, but essentially we're talking about interoperability and clinical data exchange here. Another just quick point, a general point, is we've seen we can look at virtually any kind of facility in this analysis. So we've looked at large health systems comprising multiple hospitals and many providers, but we've also looked at smaller sort of mom and pop providers. And we also look at different kinds of providers. So for example, nursing homes, we would look at specific factors like falls and bed sores and other more specialized metrics that are unique to nursing homes. But we've also had recent conversations with clients about dental, which is a little bit different. So point here is it really spans a broad variety of providers, and we're really trying to focus on members as well. So let me look at the slide here in detail. On the leftmost column, we are talking about establishing centers of excellence and assigning dedicated resources from the provider to those. We're really trying to collaborate, foster a collaboration between the payer and the provider to look at network capabilities. We are creating member quality outreach programs. So what we're trying to do here is really provide a set of wraparound services that that help the member get better and use healthcare system appropriately. Again, it could be dental offices, nursing homes, PCPs, and so on. This second column from the left, creating care quality management. As it says there, really we're focusing on integrating the healthcare delivery across the entire spectrum of healthcare services. So that's obviously inpatient, ER, prescription, and so on. And then we're looking at partner strategies. We could buy, build through call center and member outreach. So that's really trying to create a set of services for each member to help with that, with care quality. Third from the left, so second from the right, we're talking about a little bit of a shift in the approach to care management. It's a more holistic approach, a little bit more empathetic or patient-centric view. And when you look at it from that lens, you get new strategies that can save money longer term. Sometimes there's an upfront shorter term cost, but it pays dividends in the longer term typically. So we're talking about some novel patient engagement strategies here that could include digital and in-person approaches. And we're coupling that with kind of an innovative care management model, which, as I said, is a shift from a more traditional model focused exclusively on savings, both in short term and long term, to look at it a little bit more from a long term aspect. And we're finally supplementing them with technology. So could be digital tools for patients, but it could also be machine learning and predictive modeling to identify members who could benefit the most from outreach. We're going to talk about technology as part of our case study in a slide or two here. And then the fourth area on the right is really talking about sharing those insights with providers. We're really trying to provide them a much more robust picture than they have had before. And I want to just touch on one of our large clients, actually the same one that Eric mentioned. We found that the way to make analytics truly actionable at that client was really going the last mile. So turning the information we were generating through analytics into actions. So actions being outreach to patients directly, but also seminars for providers about case management, care management, and outreach, seminars that relate to network contracting and so on, really trying to give providers a picture of their whole business. We'll touch on this again in the next couple of slides, but we also used machine learning as a proof of concept to clean up provider panels. I'll get into that in a little more detail. And really what we're trying to do again is just to deliver the provider a much more robust picture of their business than they've had before.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate that. I think particularly insightful is meeting the member or meeting the provider where they are along that path. So certain providers needing certain levels of information or providing seminars, I think that can be a very impactful and a great partnership intervention.
Well, that's a great point, Aviva. In fact, that's a really great point that I want to just pick up and build on slightly.
Sure.
Every provider group is different.
Absolutely.
Many members are different. We all know this, but we're really talking about a very customized, tailored approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all, which I think is very valuable.
And I think unique to the way that Trexin approaches our engagement with our clients.
Totally agree.
So, John, I appreciate that insight. And now I'd like to turn to a particular passion of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And let's jump into a case study impacting our providers around machine learning.
Right, thank you. So this, just to be clear, was a proof of concept that our client asked us to do to see if we could optimize some of what they had, a job they had to do. So in particular, they were looking at their network, assigning providers into tiers. So from most effective in tier 1 to least effective in tier 4. And they were trying to essentially eliminate providers from their network in tiers 3 and 4, and therefore had a number of members who needed to be reassigned to those remaining providers in tiers 1 and 2. So when you think about that problem in the abstract, you want to match members to providers who relate to their specific needs. Who it could be age, so you might need a gerontologist or a pediatrician. Could be sex, could be your diagnoses, where you are, how close you are to the provider, and so on. So we need to consider all those factors. And they had started down a manual path that they thought was going to take many, many months to do manually, to look through all of those members in both of those two provider tiers and figure out who would be a good match. And so they again asked us to create a proof of concept using machine learning. So what we did was work with a local client subject matter expert. I may use the term SME from time to time here, but that's what that means, to understand what all those factors would be. And we asked that SME to sit down and look at a small sample, about 1,000 people, I think, 1,000 members, and assign members to providers based on the criteria that they thought were most reasonable. And then we used that data to train a recursive partitioning model. Maybe a little bit jargony here, but it
Tell me what that means,
yes.
Jen.
So if you just, the simplest way to think of it is a decision tree where every decision is assigned by the algorithm based on the most information you can get. So it'll look at the most important variable at the first step, and it'll take the whole space of potential fits, and it will say, well, really, age is most important, or location is most important, whatever the case may be. And then it assigns that as the first step. Then you get 2 pieces from that. And then at each step of that process, recursively then, the space is subdivided further and further as you move down the steps. And at each step, the algorithm assigns the variable that has the most impact and balances the 2 groups that it's splitting most effectively. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thanks for the example.
Sure. Yeah. So that's and it's a really nice algorithm to use in this particular case because it is one of the transparent machine learning algorithms. You can look at the output of this and see exactly what it did and see which criteria it used to split the space at every step.
It's a great feedback tool to the SME to validate, it sounds like, and also allows us to validate that information with our clients.
Exactly.
And also potentially explain to the member who is matched why we thought that was a really important match.
That is exactly.
And a good fit.
Yep, that's exactly right. And there are other algorithms we could have used. For example, neural networks come to mind, which may have been as effective in partitioning the space, but would be completely opaque. In other words, no one could see why it did what it did. And that's just not nearly as effective as you pointed out.
Thank you.
Yeah, so just a couple more points here. It actually had extremely high fit, unusually high fit for algorithms like this, but it's a fairly straightforward problem. And we had the benefit of that SME looking at the population and assigning providers for us for a small sample of the population that we could then extrapolate to the full population. And that was what we did. And we did that in a very short period of time, certainly less than a month. I think it was actually a couple of weeks. And we got very good results, which they then used. And I don't remember what the dollar savings was, Eric, maybe you do, but it was in the more than $1 million range, as I recall.
Yeah, and I think the other piece too here, as we talked about provider performance and creating that data fluency and culture of data, a big thing with government sponsored providers or government members going to providers is that those members have to be assigned to a particular provider. And so with this system in place, we'd be able to accurately assign people to the right panels, to the people who are going to take care of them most effectively, and provide them a proactive reassignment that we haven't really seen anywhere else. And in fact, Armin and I, when we were at this client, helped them work with the state to try to engage them with proactive reassignment. And the state was very receptive in not only building that sort of algorithm for that client, but for everybody within the state. So this definitely has future implications that go beyond a certain client or a certain state. It could be very instrumental within the government space.
Particularly from a primary care perspective, as a former hospital administrator, we know how important that is. And so, Eric, when you spoke to the concept of a government provider, I think what you're speaking to is a patient who's elected Medicaid or Medicare as their primary source of insurance coverage. And so I think just to be kind of clear about that definition, as patients elect that type of insurance, but it also happens on the private, if you were to elect a private insurance carrier, not in the Medicare, Medicaid space, that you would also be assigned a PCP as your primary care provider and be reassigned if that PCP left your network.
Yeah.
So,
and I think too, I know it says here that it's a caveat, but it'd be great if you were in an HMO plan or even a commercial plan, and somebody gave you a list of the top 7 PCPs, so top 7 specialists based off of this criteria, what your history is of claims, of pharmacy, of wherever you are, to say, okay, there's 7.6 or let's call it 8 providers that you could go to. Which one would you like to go to? And that feedback too from patients, not only from SMEs, could help train the model in terms of finding similar patients and ranking providers based off of that as well. So
taking it a step further, and again, meeting patients and meeting providers where they are in the process.
Yeah, Eric, that's a great point too. And I did list it as a caveat from the sort of machine learning standpoint, but that is in fact exactly how they used it at the client, as you think you know. So in fact, coming up with a list of providers for individual members that they could choose from was really perfect for their needs. And to your point, then an additional kind of iteration we would consider if we were going to evolve this approach would be using members' ultimate choices as further refinement to the algorithm. So great point.
Eric, can you tell us a little bit about the provider performance methodology?
Sure. So with provider performance, what we realize is there is a ton of data, but it is very segmented. And it could be things simple as you go to your PCP and they send your claim to the pharmacy, and the pharmacy and the PCP never communicate whether that member picked it up. Those claims don't make it into the HEDIS reporting software, so the PCP is dinged for not being compliant for that piece, and a patient's acuity level or risk level goes up. And all of those different data points were in this sphere of data that nobody really knew how everything was connected or where everything should be or interjoined. And so when we took a look at that and began assessing the current environment of the client, what we realized is we really needed to first get all the data in the right place, match it across one member key, and then be able to compile a report that was meaningful, but also ingestible for the end user. So that could be anybody from the business stakeholders to the actual providers, who most of which said that they hadn't seen reporting like this before. And so
Eric, what you're speaking to is kind of the swirl of data that's generated. And so in our healthcare environment, as we know, working in this field for years, we understand that there is just analysis paralysis a little bit because folks are overwhelmed by the data. So this approach that you're going to talk to us about is another way in which we can look at this and create some meaningful information to drive actionable results.
Exactly.
That's a great point. It really speaks to that last mile that I was talking to earlier, and you've spoken to as well, is going to the member where they are. It's very important because not every member, to Eric's point, can ingest, or not every provider can ingest data that's more raw. So we have to provide it for them in a way that they can take in.
Exactly. And so with that, the analysis paralysis that you mentioned, we tried to take that data synthesis and compile what are the key important sources for data. And a lot of these have been mentioned already, but the cost, the quality, pharmacy, HEDIS, so on and so forth. all of those key metrics and all of those key KPIs were all then compiled into one report. And that report is what we call the provider handbook or provider report. And so this
What's a KPI, Eric?
key performance indicator. Sorry.
Thank you.
So all those key performance indicators across all those different work streams were what we tried to capture within this provider handbook. And I think we can talk at lengths about the benefit of the provider handbook, but I really think the key important one was that it was continually built with the provider's input. We talked earlier about the machine learning, but it was really about getting that feedback and testing, feedback testing, until we started to create a product that providers wanted and providers understood. And so it was a really important end-to-end solution that we built out here. And we were able to create a lot of good insights for the providers that we created this for. And it was a paper offering, but this is something that could be sent digitally, and something that, as we continue to build out, can be built upon visualization tools such as Tableau, Power BI, and a provider could be in their office, hit refresh, and have their patients' data benchmarked against other patients with similar conditions, or have their overall patient history within that report. So really, it has a lot of future implications as well, not only from this handbook standpoint.
Again, meeting the providers where they are and iteratively going through the process. So I'd ask Armin, how about you jump in here and tell us a little bit more about that provider partnerships and some of our report examples?
Yep, absolutely. And like Eric was saying, we got a lot of feedback from providers to find what was going to be most useful for them. So here we have a couple of the pieces of data that we found most impactful. Sort of as you were talking about before, or as you mentioned, Aviva, trying to find meaningful data that could create something actionable for these providers. And a lot of providers, especially the smaller ones, have pretty limited analytical capabilities. So for us to be able to take what we found as useful data and what they agreed was useful data and give it to them in a digestible way was really, really effective. And so here, just kind of working from left to right on these examples here. First one on the left, there was a member outreach list that we created. And so what we were able to do is take a whole variety of factors for each individual member and sort of compile them into a risk model and create a ranked list for those providers, so that they could understand who their highest risk members were, those who maybe were going to be at highest risk of going to the emergency room or going to the hospital, so that they could have a targeted and prioritized list of members for outreach. So if they wanted to call their top 5 highest risk members, here are their names, here's their contact information, so they would be able to get those folks in for a doctor's appointment, try to prevent them from going to the ER. Next over was a tiering analysis, and so here what we did was take cost and quality indexes that we had created, so sort of a forced ranking of providers, and putting them into a tier of 1 through 4 based on whether they were high or low cost, high or low quality, and helping the providers understand where each of their individual doctors stood based on the outcomes of their members. And so what this did is gave sort of opportunities for remediation, for coaching, for providers, and understanding, helping them understand which doctors were maybe having different outcomes from others, and who was sort of performing the best and who was performing sort of in places where they could improve. Next over, membership attribution. So for a managed care organization, members are assigned to a primary care provider. And what this tool allowed our providers to do was see how many of their assigned members are actually going to them, or how many of their assigned members are going to another provider. So give them sort of at a glance which members would be kind of a high priority for outreach if they were not going to any provider, which of their members were maybe just going to another provider altogether and maybe were an opportunity for reassignment. And for all of those members, sort of what their MLR was, what the outcomes were for those members based on who they were going to see. And then finally, diagnostic conditions in practice. This was a tool that allowed providers to see what some of their major cost drivers were for their members and how they compared year over year to themselves, as well as how they compared to other providers within the network. And so gave cost data, gave admin data for some of the top groupings of procedures, which were called episode treatment groups or ETGs. And sort of at a high level for each one of those groups, how they compared across the plan and even to themselves over the years.
And with that membership attribution piece, talking about meeting the provider where they are, this is exactly what something like the machine learning algorithm can help them with. Because when we go in and say you have 1,000 out of your 2,000 members who aren't seeing you, their response is, okay, and what are you doing to help me with that? To which we respond, well, we actually have an algorithm that's trying to place those members correctly. Additionally, you have another 500 that are coming to you that aren't assigned to you. So we're using that to try to get those members into your assignment or under your purview. And then additionally, what we talked about, some providers have limited analytics capabilities. What we found too is with this handbook and with these reports, we met with some provider groups that were actually very advanced with analytics and with data, and this satiated all of their concerns and their needs. And again, this was their response or their feedback was that this is stuff that they hadn't seen before, or at least not compiled in this way, and that it was of a lot of value for them. So,
thank you, Eric. So we've talked a lot about how to reduce the cost of great care today. So in summary, Trexin has offered a multiple prong approach, ranging from medical management, network optimization, engaging and enabling providers by sharing data, and optimizing pharmacy use by encouraging members to improve their use of their medications and appropriately using generics to adhere to their prescriptions. The holistic cost of care approach that we talked about moves from documenting the current state to establishing a strategy. So from there, deep analytics can uncover opportunities for cost savings and improved outcomes, which can then be executed or iteratively optimized. Our case study with this approach yielded a cost savings for a client of more than $100 million, and we delved into a member-specific view, so you could see that at the member level. Our provider performance approach has a strong focus on understanding the true needs of members and our providers that we partner with, and leverages the thoughtful use of deep analytics to give providers a compelling and actionable picture of their patients, their costs, and their outcomes. The machine learning case study that John delved into on a member reassignment showed a high accuracy and a proof of concept or POC predictive model and realized savings immediately for minimal investment. We appreciate the great conversation from this panel today. Thank you for talking with us about the cost of care, and we're going to open it up for some questions and answers we received from audience members in our social media platforms and colleagues throughout the healthcare continuum. So one of the questions we received is quite tactical. Can this be implemented on both the payer and the provider side, or is this really a payer focus or a provider focus?
This is John. I'll start, and maybe one of Eric or Armand could jump in as well. It's absolutely both is the answer. So analytics is analytics, and we've already talked about how our provider performance approach is very much about sharing and collaborating. And we've talked a lot about synergy and establishing collaboration between different groups in a synergistic way. So my answer would be, from a payer standpoint, absolutely. This makes sense to look at, and many of our clients have been payers, but certainly providers can look at this in their own way and optimize their businesses. And as ACOs, MCOs, and so on are set up, it's explicitly a provider-payer collaboration kind of an entity. So I think the answer quickly is both. I'm not sure whether you guys have other thoughts there.
Yeah, and I fully agree. And I think John covered the specific to primary care or hospital physicians, but I think we talked about earlier, we've had dental clients that have reached out to talk about sort of this provider performance approach or how they could optimize their network. So I don't think it's limited in the realm of, oh, this needs to be primary care, oh, this needs to be hospital-based. It could be dental, it could be pharmaceutical, it It could be anything across the healthcare continuum to really help optimize their business, identify their true cost drivers, and then try to figure out solutions around what are those cost drivers and how they can make an impact.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, John. I think to your point, Eric, around the great opportunities, even from a nursing home perspective. So looking at long-term care, LTACs and SNFs, where there's great opportunity across that healthcare continuum, particularly for folks at the end of their lives from a member perspective. So opportunities to improve care across the continuum and reducing that cost, providing greater value. Let's talk about how large the teams need to be to execute strategies like this. We've talked at length about how we can bring in teams to look at these problems and help solve these problems. Are we talking about 100 people coming to a client, or what are we looking at?
Yeah, so our team for one of the clients we were at was obviously much smaller than that. We had a team of about 8. I think that's about right. And that included folks who were more on the operations side, but then also others who were on the technical side. So folks who were doing who were SQL architects, who were driving the analytics platform, and then others who were on the operations side, getting those reports out to providers, and also interact with the providers on the ground. And so, yeah, it's definitely a much smaller size than 100 even.
I think it speaks to, though, the flexibility of Trexin's team, that we have the capability to provide that great depth of knowledge, both from a business or requirements perspective, and also, and share some of that expertise that we've gained, but also bringing in the technical perspective and everything from machine learning experts to SQL coders. So.
And I'll just point out one thing quickly. If you think about a team of 8 over the course of a year, and then you compare that to $100 million in savings that we found, the ROI is pretty clear on that kind of approach.
Very strong
Even
ROI.
With a 100-person team, frankly, it would still be good ROI.
But we can do it with 8.
Right.
So tell us about what would make this successful from a client's perspective. What's a prerequisite? What do clients need in place to make this work? And what have we really seen as barriers to success in this approach? I think all of us have worked with clients where we say, hey, if we only had this in place prior, this might have moved the needle a little faster, or wow, they really did a great job and we're ready to come to the table and really help them drive to success in partnership.
And I think that is a key, right? That is maybe the fundamental key. So what sets a client up for success, to me, is a willingness to engage and collaborate. They could have all the best intentions in the world, but if they're not providing people on their side who are fully engaged, it's not really going to be a successful engagement. They need to go the last mile. They need to own the solution themselves in collaboration, with our help, but they really do own the solution from a business standpoint. And to the first question in that series, what are clients really looking for? What do they consider successful? It's a business, and what they're looking for is bottom line savings, so MLR savings in particular, but they also, of course, want to keep quality outcomes for their members. So I'm sure that other people have thoughts as well. I wanted to touch on those points.
Yeah, I think those are great, John. But I think additionally, as far as a prerequisite is concerned, is for a client to be willing to trust the data. I mean, I think the healthcare industry in general is slow to move and slow to change, and so often some of the responses you get from providers, especially, is, well, we've always done it this way, so why would we do it a different way?
Herman, change is scary.
Of course,
right?
And we totally understand that, and especially when we're trying to take data and talk to doctors and say, well, here, this is what the data shows, but I'm not a doctor, so why should I be telling them how to do their job? It really takes a lot of asking questions and having those conversations rather than just going in and telling somebody this is how you should change. Just helping them understand how this is the data that we see. This is how we want to try to help you, rather than pushing them to change the way they're doing things.
So Armin, being on the other side of that table, having been in conversations with physicians as a hospital administrator, one of the biggest learnings that I had was really to find my champion. You want a champion who's going to speak to that so that it's peer-to-peer conversations as well. So we can help provide all the information that they need to be successful in those conversations. But sometimes you really just need the person who's been sitting next to that other provider for the last 15 years, right? To help drive that conversation. So sometimes it's all about building that relationship. And I think when you have a champion that takes this information and runs with it to their peers, that can really make a difference in the way that that information is adopted.
Yep, absolutely.
I think that's a great point, and I do think it also speaks to all of what we've just said. Speaks to that sort of, maybe empathetic is the wrong word, at least a sympathetic approach where you put yourself in the other person's shoes. So Armand was talking about, why should a provider trust us? We're not providers, and I think a lot of that has to do with our ability to understand their concerns, what they might be legitimately concerned with, try to address that, try to work with them to come up with a solution that works for them as well. Champion is the same idea. So a champion already has that built-in understanding of what it's like from the other side. And if a champion is working with their peers, that helps us because we have an instant in a way that's kind of already understanding what the other side is going through.
Absolutely.
And I think the other piece too, just one more component to add on, is to have patience. I think this is not just streamlining a piece of the production line or trying to speed up a transaction. This is a changing member behavior, and with certain interventions, it could take 6 months or it could take a year. And so having that buy-in from the beginning, having a champion, having people who believe in the process and trusting the process, there needs to be an air of patience that this isn't going to happen overnight. And to use a medical analogy, it's not splinting something or throwing a cast on. We're doing like physical therapy in a sense. So if we're trying to rehab and slowly build up back to a steady process that they can continue to govern and implement, and not just put a Band-Aid on it.
And Eric, I think PT is an apt analogy. You got to flex that muscle, right? And sometimes it's a little creaky.
That's right.
And so sometimes it does take a bit of time to build up. So I think we'd like to end with a question looking forward to the future. So cost of care has evolved greatly in the last 10 years. And if we think about where we were 10 years ago in this field versus where we are today, and the items that you and I take for granted almost as some of our, basic learnings, our core building blocks of learnings on cost of care. I am so excited to look forward to the future in the next 3 to 5 years and see how areas like machine learning and AI will propel us forward. And how that will impact the healthcare landscape here domestically in the US, but also as we learn from across the world. So with that in mind, I'd like to give a chance to each of our panelists to share a little bit about where cost of care will propel forward in the next 3 to 5 years. And we'll end on that note. So I'll turn it over first to Armand.
Sure. I think one of the things, or a couple of things. First of all, there's always going to be more data, right? So where we're at now, in the next several years, there are just going to be more inputs to that program, and maybe things that we don't have access to now will become available in the next couple of years as healthcare becomes slowly more digitized and we have access to more data. It just gives us the ability to use more things as inputs into the model. But I think also we'll be able to help understand what has worked, what hasn't, and especially as we continue to work with clients who've implemented some of these solutions, and continue to iterate, continue to refine that model over time so that it becomes more and more reliable as we move on.
Thank you, Armand. Let's go to Eric.
Sure. So I think building off of that, one of the things that has been prevalent within healthcare is payers tend to be on the front end of trying to innovate or continuing to come up with new ways of trying to cut costs or optimize their solutions. And I feel that there's been more of that in the provider space, and they're beginning to catch up. So I think the next 3 to 5 years, as people become more data fluent, as people become more entrenched within the analytics and how they can bend the cost curve. That's one area to focus on. And then I think also John mentioned FHIR, so new technologies that promote interoperability between different EMR systems, that promote interoperability between the payer and provider, and make collaborative measures more easily accessible between the two. And then lastly, I think it's a personalization of healthcare. So not just putting one umbrella or one network or one treatment plan for all members, but really breaking it down at both the member and the network level, and trying to figure out what are ways that we can personalize medicine so that maybe a certain group only needs a certain network because that network can take care of their needs better than another network. Maybe a certain group may only need to be with this type of PCP or this type of specialist for their treatment. So to your point of view, as AI, as data continues to advance, as interoperability continues to progress, then I think that we'll start to see more of a personalization of medicine, of healthcare, and then that should lower the cost in the long run.
Thank you, Eric. And John, parting words.
And I have to follow these two guys, that's fine. It took all my stuff. No, I do have a thought about building on what Eric was talking about in terms of sharing data. And you mentioned, because we've been mentioning it this way, provider and payer data collaboration through FHIR and so on. And I'll just throw in my own personal story. Having been a patient using the healthcare system somewhat heavily, recently I found that my access on my phone to my own personal data, all my lab results, et cetera, everything that was collected by the providers, I can also see. And I feel that's made me a better patient and a better member from the payer side. So I think that's another aspect of that collaboration and sharing data. I will say, I think that everything that we've talked about today is really critical as a foundation. I think many entities, many of our prospective clients have voiced to us that they want to move forward with machine learning and AI. And what we often find is that they're not actually quite ready for that because they do not have the foundations in place. So laying a foundation, as we've talked about today, is very, very important in establishing value from machine learning and AI. And it just as one last example of what we think is coming. So Eric touched on personalized, did you call it medicine? There's another sense of that word because you were referring to it in this sort of provider way, and looking at costs and outcomes. Personalized medicine in AI is the promise, and I think it's a ways off personally. I think it's an area of research that's not quite fully mature yet, but I think the promise of personalized medicine as it relates to AI is really looking at every aspect of a person for which we can get data, including genomics and so on, and really trying to tailor approaches of care to that individual as opposed to a cohort of people, or could be a cohort of people still. But if we're talking about genomics, that gets very, very specific. So I think that's a really exciting area as well.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Armin. Thank you all for listening in to the conversation today. Please contact us at the links shown.